First, we return to our coverage of the attack in Boston. More than 9,000 people from law enforcement agencies all across the country were in the city this week to help track down the two men who paralyzed the city for days. And the key was how well they were able to work together toward a common goal. Joining me now is an expert on communication between agencies, Dr. Andrew Ishak of Santa Clara University. Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it. You know, this was a fascinating, a gripping, a suspenseful, a terrifying last few days for our national audience watching this unfold. And we know that agencies and jurisdictions and bureaus from all over the country all collaborated in trying to capture the suspects, in this case, the alleged suspects. How many people and how many different agencies were actually involved?
Hundreds, thousands of people, and a number of agencies. If you think about in the state of Massachusetts alone, you have Boston Police, you have their special forces as well, which include things like SWAT teams. You have Massachusetts State Police, you have FBI, and you have a number of other jurisdictions that are trying to help as well.
So with all of those different elements all trying to work together toward the same mission, obviously, how difficult is it to communicate, and is there a hierarchical stature in the sense that the FBI might take precedent because it's the federal government, or would it be the local investigators? How do they figure out who's responsible for what?
It's a good question. There are a lot of challenges because when you have a lot of different agencies, they might have different communication patterns. For example, one group might use 10 codes, say 10-4, things like that. Another group might not use those. And so finding out the different patterns among each group is difficult. In terms of the hierarchy, it's going to depend on the area. If you look at a city like New York, for example, New York has 5 counties. So should the counties take precedent or the city? A city like LA has a county like LA has 68 cities in it. And so to find out who's in charge, city, county, state, FBI, it's going to depend on the individual municipality, but what's important is that they do it beforehand.
Do you think perhaps there was some tension in terms of figuring out that landscape going into this situation? No one was planning for this, obviously.
Right.
But do you think that the emphasis on communication and all of the investment that's been made in upgrading communications infrastructure since 9/11 paid dividends in terms of what happened this week?
Absolutely, no question. They've spent a lot of time and money in the last 10 years making sure that these agencies know how to work together beforehand. So, for example, in Boston, recently they had a 24-hour simulation involving a number of jurisdictions, including doctors and nurses. And they practiced things like applying tourniquets and being in the right place at the right time, and that paid off on Monday and also paid off yesterday as well.
So this was not sprung on local forces. They had trained previously for an event just like this, even though it's hopefully unfathomable for most of us. You still have to be ready.
Right. No question they're prepared for it. I'd say Boston's more prepared than almost any other city. And for me, I've observed SWAT teams and bomb squads in other parts of the country, and I can tell you that they practice with things like IEDs that are detonated by cell phones, which is exactly what happened on Monday. And so they take past experiences and they use them to make sure that they're prepared for anything that comes in the future.
Now, I know obviously events were unfolding in real time. It's hard to game plan or forecast for that. With respect to how it ended up in terms of a firefight in a residential neighborhood, did that surprise you given the fact that there were all these forces coming together and yet the public did end up endangered, certainly in that circumstance?
Well, it's always a challenge, and you know, being in the media, that even if it wasn't in a residential area, people would be there somehow. The suspects aren't going to put themselves, they're not going to isolate themselves completely at times because it's easier for them to hide in crowds. And so that's always a challenge.
You know, one last question for you, Dr. Ishak. There was such a wide swath of land that had to be addressed here. You know, I'm sure all different kinds of agencies are receiving tips. How do they figure out how to narrow down their search and fine-tune it to actually try to find suspects in this case?
That's a good question, because I heard the FBI, after putting out the suspects' photos, they receive something like 10,000 tips a minute, a crazy amount. And what they have to do really is rely on their knowledge. These are experts in what they do. Some of them have been doing it for decades. And so they take their past experiences and say, this tip sounds right to me, this tip doesn't sound right. And they're able to narrow down to the tips that are going to be most effective, most salient for them.
I think most of us are absolutely in awe of how effective authorities, both state, local, and federal, were able to collaborate to bring about, certainly not a happy ending, but a relieving one for many people in Boston.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you so much for your insight. We appreciate it. Let me send it over now to Anthony to get a check of the weather. Anthony?
Thank you, Sam.